The car was already burning when the first sirens reached the edge of the county road. Flames climbed through twisted metal like they knew exactly where to go, devouring what looked, at first glance, like a tragic accident. A husband slumped lifeless behind the wheel. A wife thrown clear, declared dead at the scene. Another routine entry in America's long ledger of roadside deaths. That's what everyone believed. That's what the husband wanted them to believe. But accidents don't whisper, and this one did, and somewhere beneath the smell of gasoline and scorched rubber, there was something else. A detail so small it was almost missed, yet so wrong it would unravel everything. Investigators would later say that if the wind had shifted, if the fire had burned just a few minutes longer, the truth would have vanished forever. But history has a way of resisting burial, especially when the dead refuse to stay silent. And this was not a crime of passion. It was not sudden. It was slow, calculated, and rehearsed in the quiet moments of marriage, moments where smiles hide resentment and trust becomes a weapon. For years, this man lived beside his wife, shared meals with her, slept inches from her, all while preparing a lie big enough to survive fire, steel, and death itself. He believed a staged crash could erase guilt. He believed the road would take the blame. And in small American towns, stories like this are supposed to stay simple. A crash, a loss, a funeral. Life moves on, but sometimes the past pushes back. Sometimes a single unanswered question, a bruise that doesn't match the impact, a seatbelt that tells a different story, a clock that refuses to line up, becomes a crack in the narrative. And once that crack appears, the entire structure begins to collapse. And what police uncovered next would expose not just a murder, but the terrifying intimacy of betrayal. Because the most dangerous place for this woman was never the road that night. It was the marriage she trusted, and in the days that followed the crash, the town did what towns always do. Flowers appeared along the roadside, a makeshift cross leaned into the dirt. People spoke in hushed tones about fate, about bad luck, about how quickly life can end on a dark stretch of asphalt. The husband played his role perfectly. He cried at the right moments. He thanked first responders. He told anyone who would listen that his wife had been everything to him. Grief, after all, is a powerful disguise, but behind the closed doors of the investigation, something didn't sit right. The fire had erased most of the evidence, but not all of it. A veteran officer noticed the first inconsistency almost by instinct. The angle of the vehicle suggested a high-speed loss of control, yet the skid marks told a calmer story. The car hadn't fought the road. It had followed it, almost obediently, as if guided there. And then came the medical examiner's report. The cause of death, officially listed as trauma from the crash, carried a quiet footnote, bruising along the arms, deep pattern marks that didn't match a steering wheel or shattered glass. These injuries had formed before the impact, before the fire. They told a story of restraint, not collision, of force applied by hands, not momentum, and when questioned again, the husband adjusted his story. Small changes, harmless ones, he claimed. Memory was unreliable after trauma, time blurred, but lies, even careful ones, have a rhythm, and his rhythm was off. He described events in reverse order. He mentioned sounds no one else reported hearing. He remembered details that should have been impossible to recall through smoke and unconsciousness. And investigators began to pull at the thread. Financial records revealed a life insurance policy quietly expanded just months before the crash. Friends spoke of arguments that never reached police ears. A marriage that looked stable from the outside, but rotted quietly within. Control disguised as care. Jealousy mistaken for devotion. And the crash was no longer an accident. It was a stage. And the husband, once the grieving survivor, was becoming something else entirely in the eyes of the law. Not a victim of fate, but an author of death. And as detectives widened their focus, the past began to surface in fragments. Text messages recovered from a damaged phone, emails never meant to be read by anyone else, silences that now felt deliberate. The wife had been preparing to leave, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly enough to avoid confrontation. She had spoken to a close friend about fear, about the way arguments seemed to tighten around her like a closing door. She said she didn't feel safe. She never said why. She never had the chance. And the husband's public grief started to crack under private scrutiny. Neighbors recalled late-night shouting, the kind that stops abruptly when someone realizes they're being heard. Co-workers mentioned how he monitored her movements, how he appeared unexpectedly, how his concern always felt slightly off. Not loving, possessive, the kind of attention that leaves no room to breathe, and the most disturbing revelation came from the vehicle itself. Hidden beneath layers of fire damage, a forensic specialist found that the driver's seat had been adjusted far back, too far for the wife's height. She couldn't have driven comfortably that way. But the husband could, which meant something unthinkable had happened before the crash. Someone had moved her body. Someone had placed her where she didn't belong, and police reconstructed the night in slow motion. An argument. Escalation. Hands where hands should never be. When she stopped resisting, the plan began. The road chosen carefully, the curve just sharp enough, gasoline introduced to ensure silence, fire to erase fingerprints, fibers doubt, or so he thought. And interrogators pressed harder now, and under pressure, people don't just lie, they reveal themselves. The husband grew defensive, then cold. He spoke of betrayal, of humiliation, of being pushed. Words that tried to share the blame with the dead. That, more than anything, confirmed what investigators already knew. Accidents don't come with justifications. And by the time the arrest warrant was signed, the town's story had inverted. The man they pitied was now the monster among them. The woman they mourned had become a voice, finally heard, echoing through police files and court transcripts. But the most unsettling part was still to come, because the detail that broke the case open wasn't the bruises, or the seat, or the money. It was something almost invisible, something hiding in plain sight, and it was a single photograph that shifted everything. Taken by a passing motorist moments before the flames consumed the vehicle, it was originally dismissed as useless. Blurred, poorly lit, barely legible. But when a forensic analyst enlarged the image frame by frame, a detail emerged that should not have existed. The wife's seatbelt was fastened, perfectly aligned, untorn. Not locked from the force of impact. It hadn't done what seatbelts do in high-speed crashes. It hadn't saved her, because it was buckled after she was already gone. And that detail rewrote the entire timeline. If she had been alive during the collision, the belt would have locked under sudden deceleration. Fibers would show stress. Instead, it lay flat, obedient, staged. The fire hadn't burned it. The crash hadn't pulled it. Someone had clicked it into place by hand, calmly, carefully, after death. And when confronted with this evidence, the husband stopped pretending. His grief hardened into something colder. He claimed exhaustion, claimed confusion, claimed the system was hunting him. But the more he spoke, the more the mask slipped. His words circled back to control, how things had gotten out of hand, how she wouldn't listen, how he just wanted it to stop. These were not the words of a man haunted by loss. They were the confessions of someone angry that the truth refused to stay buried, and in court, prosecutors laid the story bare. A marriage built on dominance, a woman planning escape, a man who chose permanence instead. The stage crash was meant to transform murder into misfortune, to let the road shoulder the guilt he couldn't carry. But fire does not purify lies. It exposes them, and when the verdict was read, there was no outburst, no collapse, just a quiet acceptance, as if some part of him had known all along this would be the ending. The sentence ensured he would never walk free again. But justice, as it often does, arrived late. Too late for the woman who trusted him, too late to undo the final ride she never chose, and yet, her story remains, not as an accident, not as a statistic, but as a warning that the most convincing lies are often the ones we want to believe. And even after the trial ended and the headlines faded, the case refused to rest. It lingered in police training rooms, in quiet conversations between investigators, in the memories of those who realized too late that something had been wrong all along. This wasn't just a story about a murder disguised as an accident. It was a study in how easily evil can pass as ordinary, how a familiar face can become a blindfold, and what unsettled people most was how close the truth came to disappearing. If the fire had burned a little hotter, if that photograph had never been taken, if one officer hadn't trusted his instincts, the husband would have walked free, his version of events accepted without resistance. The system nearly did what it so often does. It believed the survivor, and this case exposed a darker pattern buried deep in American history. Many murders don't begin with violence, they begin with control, with isolation, with slow erosion of a person's will until escape feels impossible. By the time the final act occurs, the groundwork has already been laid, and the outside world is unprepared to see it for what it is. And the wife's friends later said there were signs. Subtle ones. Missed calls never returned. Invitations declined. A personality that seemed to shrink over time. But hindsight is a cruel teacher. It reveals what fear hides in real time. And fear, when shared with the wrong person, can be fatal. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? And because stories like this force an uncomfortable question. How well do we really know the people closest to us? How often do we mistake silence for peace, routine for safety? The road that night didn't kill this woman. The lie did, and lies don't end at the scene of the crime. They ripple outward, shaping families, towns, and memories long after the verdict is read, and long after the courtroom emptied. The husband's name slipped quietly into the archives, filed away under solved cases and closed chapters. But the echo of what he did never truly left. In towns like this, The past doesn't disappear. It seeps into the soil, into the way people look twice at passing cars, into the silence that falls when someone mentions marriage, trust, or accidents. And investigators would later admit this case changed how they saw everything, every roadside fatality, every fire that seemed too convenient, every survivor whose story arrived neatly packaged with grief and explanations. Because this case proved how easily violence can wear the mask of tragedy, how the road, the weather, or bad luck can be blamed while a human hand goes unnoticed. And the most chilling part was not the planning, it was the patience. The husband didn't act in a moment of blind rage. He waited, he observed, he learned how systems work, how people assume, how quickly sympathy replaces suspicion. He understood that Americans are taught to trust appearances, the grieving spouse, the burned wreckage, the finality of death certificates. He almost won because of that trust. And for the victim's family, closure never arrived the way movies promise. There was no relief in knowing the truth, only a deeper ache, the knowledge that her final moments were shaped by someone she once loved. Someone who memorized her habits, her fears, her silence, and used them against her. That is a different kind of horror, one that doesn't fade with time, and cases like this remind us that history isn't just written in wars and scandals. It's written in kitchens, in bedrooms, in parked cars on quiet roads. It's written in the private decisions people make when they believe no one is watching. And sometimes the most disturbing chapters are the ones that almost never get read. And there is a reason stories like this stay with us. Not because of the fire, or the courtroom, or the sentence handed down in the end. They stay because they force us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. That the line between safety and danger is often thinner than we want to believe. That the person most capable of destroying a life is sometimes the one closest to it. And in the official records, this case is summarized in a few cold sentences, dates, charges, evidence, a conviction. But what those files can't capture is the quiet terror that preceded the crime. The long nights, the unspoken fear. The moment she realized the man beside her was no longer someone she could trust, and that leaving might cost her everything, and the staged crash failed, but the intention behind it revealed a truth older than this country itself. Violence doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it arrives calmly, methodically, wrapped in familiarity. Sometimes it waits for darkness, for isolation, for a stretch of road where no one is watching. And that is why this story belongs in the forgotten archives of American history. Not as a spectacle, not as entertainment, but as a warning etched into the past. Because every generation believes it is smarter, safer, more aware than the last. And every generation is proven wrong, and somewhere tonight, another couple will drive home together. Another argument will fade into silence. Another truth will be swallowed because it feels safer that way, and most of the time, nothing happens. But sometimes silence becomes a weapon. Sometimes the road becomes an alibi, and history remembers the fires that burn too hot, the crashes that don't add up, the lies that nearly worked. And it waits, patiently, for someone to look closer, and you were never supposed to find this story. But now that you have, it's yours to carry.